Coming up, why this may have been the absolute worst offseason for both the Brooklyn Nets and Kevin Durant to mutually decide they want to part ways. We break down all the factors around the NBA landscape in the near and long term coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. He's got you covered from DraftKings to FanDuel. And over here, I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, not only am I applying for a potential role in the revival of the Great Pumpkin Caper, I also am interested in talking about the Brooklyn Nets offseason, as I think perspective-wise, you need to keep evolving what the real factors are that have maybe pushed the pause button on trade discussions, trade market, trade value, and how Kevin Durant and the Brooklyn Nets try to move forward.
Yeah, I ended Friday thinking that it was just going to go to the Celtics, and then by Monday, I'm like, "Oh man, nothing's going to happen here." This is how quickly these things change, right? Like
this is genuine, right? Like these are genuine. Like I feel like we have very authentic conversations around this stuff where you think about it, you come to what feels like a logical conclusion, and then 2 days later you go, maybe that was completely wrong. Totally. I might have to take that back.
Oh, I'll tell you right now, just from a process standpoint, I simply can't spend long periods of time talking about things that I haven't thought about. Like I can get very passionate about things I thought about, but asking to talk about things that are just kind of whatevers are going to be a real struggle for me. This is a lot of what goes into show prep for Adam and I. Is like, we're not interested in that. But this stuff is because it's so fast. I find it so fascinating. And I think by both of us do, it's just this constant push and pull. And I think one of the reasons is because I think what we're quickly finding with this Kevin Durant trade situation is that as much as everyone wants to plant parallels and comps onto NBA history when it comes to this is unparalleled. This is not a situation that other teams have faced before with superstars. And I know every time I bring this up, it's AD and all, and it's Harden and all these guys. Every single one of those situations was different than this. And the market was different. We'll go through that in a second. Everything is different. There's no real comp for this, except that he's a superstar NBA player and he asked for a trade. That's the only one. If that's your only baseline, yes, we have lots of comps. If you want to dive into some of the nuance in it, which many do not, then we can see that this situation is kind of unparalleled. And I think when we look at it really from a high level, what you actually see, and this is what the frustration is, and you can see it in the title here, is that no one actually has any leverage here. Kevin Durant has very little, almost no leverage. The Nets have almost no leverage on a high level. And so we're just all kind of stuck. And frankly, we were kind of on board with the Boston thing, and I still am. Like, that's still where I'm going to land in terms of, I think, the most likely scenario, them and the Nets being tied. But it really comes down to just neither team nor player has anything to really bargain with here. Like they don't. And I think that's going to be the kind of the recurring theme going forward.
And one of the hardest parts, the factors, and we talked about this a lot, but just from the Brooklyn Nets organization standpoint, understanding the uncertainty that maybe surrounds a Kyrie Irving. We mentioned before, the uncertainty that surrounds a Ben Simmons. I think one of the big factors to talk about just leverage, it's the Nets can't say, well, it'll just be this if we don't get our asking price, right? We'll run it back with these guys, but there's so many question marks thereafter around what would occur if you were to hold pat for one more season and see how things unfold. That's the risk reward that the organization is doing. And then if you're other teams around the NBA, you're looking at it and going, I don't know. Like, are you guys bullish on what happens if you don't make any moves here? And that makes it hard just from the Nets side of things, from Sean Mark's perspective, from Joe Tsai's perspective. It's our 3-year sample size, not so good to feel like you can kind of go to the table with a little bit of confidence and feeling like I've got, you mentioned it, leverage over teams coming in.
Right. And so when that kind of thing is present, and other teams know that too, right? Like they understand that this is the history. They understand there's very few teams that can even enter this market right now. The trade market is totally cool. Fred Katz wrote a great piece for The Athletic, which I suggest everyone go and read, which really outlines how this summer, the one thing you can compare is this summer to 6 years ago when we saw this crazy influx of contracts go in, the Mozgov, the Biombo piece, like all these crazy contracts were entering the NBA, and they became sort of commonplace until they weren't anymore. That is a very similar situation to what is now happening with the trade market, which is like all these monster trades. You just assume that this is what's going to happen when a superstar hits the market until one day it doesn't anymore. Like one day it doesn't. If the past was so predictive, streaks would never end. So we say this a lot. Like there's just at some point everyone kind of wises up, or you just run out of teams willing to do it, because we are dealing with a finite set of teams. There's not infinite teams that can keep piling on a new set of assets. There's a set number of teams. At some point, they just run out of the assets, or they run out of the motivation or whatever. And we might have reached that point now. And the Gobert, and by the way, this Cats thing, we mentioned this 2 weeks ago. So this isn't even new. I'm just going to retread this. We said how the Gobert trade was going to make it very hard for the Nets to trade Kevin Durant. Mm-hmm. This is a doubling down on that idea. That one I am unchanged on. The Gobert trade, we said it weeks ago. You and I talked at length about it. We said if any one factor is going to really screw up this trade process, it's going to be that, because that's the new watermark by which all teams need to look at a trade. And now because of that, and a couple of these other ones, DeJounte Murray, the trade market is totally cool. It's happened for Donovan Mitchell too. And this is just where they are. Like on that piece of the leverage side, like there's usually with leverage, you build it around scarcity, or, you have people compete with each other, but that's just not happening. And so, and it's not going to create itself, I don't think. And I think if you're just telling yourself it will, it's telling yourself a lie.
Yeah, and the one part of this too is, as you say, until it doesn't happen. And I think, to your point, the NBA is aware of this. So you're also coming up against NBA teams being like, whether or not we would give up the world to get Kevin Durant, we know that in this moment, his quote unquote value is not as high, right? The perceived value of Kevin Durant, the perceived worth of what you'd be willing to give it up. So we're going to sit back. We're a game of chicken. We've heard game of chicken between the Nets and Kevin Durant, between Kevin Durant and the Nets, between the Nets and the market, between the entire market and the Brooklyn Nets, the Boston Celtics as that comp. Okay, we want Marcus Smart with Jaylen Brown and some picks. And they go, no.
Yeah.
Just to see. No. Let's see. Are you going to bend? Are you going to break? Because guess what? Most teams in these circumstances are either a team like the Boston Celtics, who had a good deal of success this past season and feel like we could probably stand pat and see how things play out over the next couple of seasons, or you're a team that's just below the championship rung. And in some ways, you would be taking a bit of a risk of putting in a lot of players and a lot of capital to take a small window swing with Kevin Durant. You go, maybe that's not worth it. In their minds, they know it's totally worth it, but they're not going to communicate that. And that's what stunts the market as well.
And you'd have to give up the farm to get them. And that would, kill some of your your long-term growth and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. This is actually really classically, I think, and we're going to get into the Kevin Durant side of this too, and like where his unique situation makes this also not a comparative situation to a lot of these other ones. But we really are looking at an example like that Spider-Man pointing meme, except there's three of them and they're pointing in a three-way circle. And because it's the Nets, it's Durant, and it's the rest of the NBA. They're all three of them. You can see how I was trying to get my fingers onto the camera because I can't figure out where my camera is. Like even though this is like episode 20,000 or whatever, and I still don't know where the camera's located to get my fingers on as I count them 1, 2, 3. No, but there's three, and there's all three of them actually, right? It's Durant, it's the Nets, and it's the rest of the NBA, and they're all just pointing at each other, waiting for something to happen because none of them on their own can actually do anything. Like none of them can force anything. Durant can't force anything. There's too much time on the contract. There's too much other stuff. We'll get to that in a second. Like the Nets can't force anything because every team in the world knows that KD has them over a barrel. And the Nets and the rest of the NBA is just pointing at both of them and saying, go do something. And then maybe we'll jump into this or move yourself or reset your own like sort of value trail around what you think this is going to be. And I don't actually know what unsticks it. Like, I don't know. Like, and that's the thing it took me 72 hours, but I went from he's going to be a Celtic to now, like, I don't think anything's ever going to happen. This is how quickly things work.
And that is why, coming up here in a second, we're going to break down Kevin Durant and the money and mentality factor of Kevin Durant that plays a big role in what the Brooklyn Nets and Kevin Durant and the NBA can hope to accomplish around this superstar talent. First, though, I'll tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. You hear us talk about them all the time. And if you haven't tried the Built Bar Puffs, well, I don't know what you're up to. Doug tells you, every single time a box gets delivered, his family goes, "Excuse me, good sir," snags that box, runs to, I assume, somewhere under the staircase, the backyard. They can go as far as they need to get away from Doug because they've been eating Built Bars. They go ahead and give you, of course, all of those great ingredients, all of energy with none of the negatives. 260 calories, a whopping 15 grams of protein in each and every one of them. Like all the Built Bars, the new cookie dough chunk puff is covered 100% real chocolate. That means they're healthy and tasty. Chocolate-covered cookie dough with a light, fluffy texture. How could you go wrong? You get over to built.com right now. Use promo code LOCKED15. You get 15% off on your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Okay, so we did a high-level view of this from maybe the NBA and the Nets perspective organizationally, but then there's the factor of Kevin Durant himself and the contract, which is, as we were doing our show prep, originally we looked at it and said, how sweet is it if you can trade for Kevin Durant? He's asking for a trade request just 1 year into the 5-year extension. He's got 4 years left. You'd love to have this guy. Or maybe it's actually hurting the market because teams would be more likely to give you additional capital and assets and players if it was a 2-year commitment, like so many are talking about. If you trade for Kevin Durant, it kicks open your next 2-year window for sure, maybe the 3rd year. If you only had him for 2 years, maybe teams would be more inclined actually to go for it, understanding we can get away from that money and get away from an aging superstar that much sooner.
Yeah, and I think that we've been operating under this guise of we have talked a decent amount about the length of the contract, and I think there's 2 ways to see that. It's like, one, it's rare for a player to ask out with this many years left on the contract, which is already a tough road to hoe, even though, again, we mentioned this many times, the Simmons did it last year, so they got a couple of these dudes. But also that it can be in the eye of the beholder. It's like, okay, well, you have him under contract for a while, or he's super old and you're going to have an old Kevin Durant, right? And so, like, it depends on how teams are going to look at that. Almost no matter what, the length of the contract is probably going. I think here's what we can agree on. I think we can agree that the length of the contract has limited the number of teams who want to get involved. I think that's a fair statement. I think, like, if there was 2 years left on the contract or a year left on the contract, you would see a lot more teams be involved. The price would be lower also because it was expiring, and you would see a much healthier market for him. I think frankly, at that point, there probably would be a bidding war around his services, because everyone could look themselves in the mirror and say, it's just 2 years. We open our championship window. We can mortgage a decent amount of the future and not tons. And the Nets ask a little lower, and it's like, whatever. But this length of the contract has totally screwed everyone up too, because the Nets can easily say, hey, dude, you get him for 4 years. And then the other teams can say, man, it sucks. We're going to have this guy for 4 years. Right? And you just then you get stuck, because I suspect what's happening also, and not like, I don't think these conversations happen like this, because I think everyone understands. If you're an NBA GM or in an office, you don't need to actually expressly say this to each other, if they're even talking at all and not through back channels. But like the contract is totally known, but everyone, it's worthless to try to explain why it's a good thing or a bad thing to somebody, like you're not selling a used car here. Right. And be like, hey, dude, it's like 20,000 miles. Like, I know it's a 2004, but look at the mileage. Look at the mileage. Like, you got to think about that.
Owned by an older couple, only drove it around town.
Right. It was the grandma. She never used it. But those were always the sweetest ones too. It was like, the car looks terrible, but it's like somehow there's 6,000 miles on it. It's like from 37 years ago. How's that possible? So
I go to feed the ducks. I come home. Who are you to ask me? Pay me the money.
Or not. Or maybe I just go nowhere. Yeah. So anyway, like, everyone's looking at this contract a different way, but I think that as we think about it, that contract has definitely left a lot of teams just not even bothering, because their window and their pieces are not ready for this right now. And a lot of teams don't have, like, more than half the teams never even probably need to put in a call, nothing more than a discovery call about it, because they just know. So I think that the contract for Durant, like you mentioned earlier, which I think is a really astute point, has really probably hampered this more than anything, when we thought it was going to be a positive. And that's why we bring it up. We thought this was going to be a positive around the Durant thing, but there's a good chance it's just probably just reality that it's just turning into a negative, I think.
And as we work our way through this offseason, we also know ahead of the draft, there's certain time periods in the offseason when trades go down. So now you combine all these factors. We mentioned Gobert at the top. We mentioned what's going on organizationally with the Nets. We mentioned the contract. You come to this place where now, like, this is the lull when things usually don't happen, and maybe forces off these conversations even further than you would anticipate around the superstar. The other part that we want to bring up too, which we said before about, is there a world where Kevin Durant would sit out? Well, he's never
Yeah.
done it before. He hangs his hat on his mentality, would always play. You would assume that unless he really is committed to not wanting to play. And again, this is an all sides kind of discussion, because on the one hand, you go, well, if he's committed to that mentality, this would maybe be where we start to turn a little bit. There has been this pause. I want to ask you the question from a Nets perspective. It's, well, game of chicken, you'll play. You're not going to sit out. Okay, that could be good for you, but then you run that little risk around injuries and getting him off your team before something potentially could happen. Now you put it on display and remind everybody how good he is and get him to the table and see how things unfold around the league. But if you're another team, I assume the injury factor is as high as possible in these discussions, because otherwise you would think you want him to benefit your team as soon as possible, as opposed to, if we don't go get him, we're going to watch him play this out. And then, where is that risk factor at that point? I guess teams are going to use it against the Brooklyn Nets, I would assume. Injury impact. And then if you don't get him off your team, you, Brooklyn, run the risk of him getting hurt, or him saying he's going to sit out, at which point that price comes down even further. Another two factors that go against Kevin Durant, against the Brooklyn Nets, and in favor of everybody else.
Yeah, because because
I had to circle myself around to the right thinking on that there.
I got it. Yeah, I got it. All indication has always been that he's not the kind of guy that would tank and sit out. Right. Yeah. That's multiple national guys have reported this or just speculated on this, whether it's coming from source material or just their own expertise following basketball. It's not clear, but that's been a sort of universal idea has been that Kevin Durant wouldn't do that. I'm not sure how much we can totally count Kevin Durant's past history as, again, predicting the future, because we never thought he would ask for a trade and we never thought he would want to team up with someone else again. That's out the window now, because he has to go to Phoenix. He has to go with CP and Booker and those guys. So I'm not sure we can totally just, hey, he's never done it before, that's the reason he's never going to do it again, angle on believing something about Durant. And I still don't believe that he would want to just sit out. And he's getting old, sit out a half a year of basketball as a trade deadline, as a trade tries to materialize. I don't see it happening, but I'm with you there. Well, then you're screwed, because you're right. He might get hurt, or he might, somehow lessen his value, or the Nets. I'm just totally with you. There's just that world doesn't really work for anyone either. Where he just comes back into the Nets, still wants to leave, but is now playing every game for a team that's sort of just treading water / sinking. How does that help anybody? It doesn't help Durant or the Nets either. So this whole game of chicken heading into the preseason and into the regular season, you can't even talk yourself into that one either, because everyone gets hurt. And no pun intended about hurt, but everyone's harmed by it.
And we're going to turn the corner into some positive things around this potentially for the Brooklyn Nets. Also, this Gobert trade in that perspective, there's actually another side to that I think maybe the NBA in general can look at over the course of this offseason. But just quickly, and this is a toss in here. Do you think that in the world where Kevin Durant doesn't go anywhere and he does play it out, could the Brooklyn Nets, and this will tease us into our closeout segment, could the Brooklyn Nets ride out a year? And if we assumed health for Kevin Durant, and a year from now say, well, it's 3 years remaining on the contract, he just played at a high level, and just see where the market lives at that point. This ties into a lot of what has happened this offseason at this point. It looks like, at least, that 33 going to be 34 in September will not get more favorable at 34 going to be 35, even if he does have a fully healthy season, because the sample size is still there. He has had injuries, but you mentioned it. What? 2 postseasons ago, from a toe on the line and taking out the Milwaukee Bucks somewhat single-handedly, that would have been the biggest resume builder and selling point to move him. Sometimes it's the time of it, as we've talked about now, and that's what seems to be hurting things more than anything.
Oh, yeah, I'll even push that further. I'll push it until Bruce Brown runs into his leg and hyperextends the knee halfway through last season. I think his value arguably was even higher. When he was the MVP candidate or the MVP favorite at that point when they just accidentally bumped, when Brown and he got caught under Bruce Brown and hurt his knee for a while.
Yeah.
He was right there. And then that kind of reset everyone on the injury piece. I mean, I guess rightfully so, but like he was injured and missed extended time again because of that move. But before that, his value was again probably nearly an all-time high then because he was just absolutely balling out every single game, and then he just missed a lot of time.
And that's why we're going to talk about here in a second how stupid the Minnesota Timberwolves should feel right now, and why Kevin Durant's contract can be spun as a positive for some of these teams looking to get the superstar suitor on their roster. Okay, first let's have some fun. Remember that time when the Minnesota Timberwolves totally messed up the market and we couldn't figure out what was going to happen for Kevin Durant and how do you get an accurate gauge on what his value is? And now we see Donovan Mitchell. Looks like that's supposed to be the barometer, but teams, even like the New York Knicks, are struggling to give up the farm. I said it. I'll say it again. Minnesota has to look pretty dumb now because you gave up an entire boatload of draft capital to get Rudy Gobert. And now without seeing, we know DeJounte Murray did get moved, really different age, factors, money, etc. But now the market's gone quiet. And if you could go back and say, because there were these ideas that, Brooklyn had asked for Minnesota, well, we want a couple of your big superstars and a boatload of picks. Well, if they had turned around and said, what if we give you 6 or 7 picks, a D'Angelo Russell and, some of these other pieces, Vanderbilt, et cetera, for Kevin Durant, they could have spent their money much more wisely, in my opinion. And it feels like they could retroactively be looking back and saying, we may have made a mistake getting so aggressive so early with a team like Utah for Gobert.
Well, as someone who's done it many times, someone has to buy at the top. And then sell at the bottom. Again, personal experience, having done it a few more times than I would wanted to in my life. Someone does it. Like someone ends up doing it, right? Someone does the complete overpay that makes everyone go, "Whoa, you did what?" And it's like, yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And the part where the graph went up for forever turns out that there was the other side of the ski slope, right? And it was like a black diamond. And like that can just be that can just be what happens. Like eventually. I know what you're saying, and I do believe, and I got into this with someone a while ago, and I can't remember who it was, and I apologize, but I was saying that now, in retrospect, I actually do wonder how close that a potential Minnesota deal like that, maybe around D'Angelo Russell instead, who wouldn't have been psyched about, but he's a guy, and that how close that would have been for Durant. I don't think it gets it done, but I think it would have looked a lot closer before the Gobert trade than it did after the Gobert trade. Post Gobert trade, it looks like a non-starter, but I think before it, you would have been like, oh man, like D'Angelo Russell, Pat Beverly, Vanderbilt, and 7 picks or swaps.
Right.
Yeah, that looks actually not too bad. About a team in Minnesota that might like not re-sign guys and could stink if Cat asks out in a couple of years. There's like a world where you could really talk yourself into that one. Now you can, obviously, but in terms of how that all played out, the one pass I would give Minnesota on that is there is a world where they just knew that Kevin Durant would just say no to that and not want to come play. And It would have been, you know what I mean? Like, and that's just not where he wanted to go. So it wasn't that's the only, short of that, I guess. But I do think that I agree with you that like, there's a world where that deal looks okay, but kind of only compared to the Gobert, only prior to the Gobert deal,
right?
Which they actually did.
Yeah, without the Gobert trade, you can't say how much better it would have been to have done a different trade for Kevin Durant. But the other part about Kevin Durant's contract and the money that I think we mentioned it as being 4 years of Kevin Durant. However, the other big thing is the NBA and salary cap is poised to go up in a massive way when TV contracts renew. So I do think, again, this is the ever unfolding onion that is the Kevin Durant Brooklyn Nets scenario. As you move along, you can push back on teams or push back on the narrative that at 33, going to be 34 years old, 4 years, it's a lot of money. 44 million ain't going to look like much 2 years from now, even if you had to, eat that money. The comp would be, not from a player standpoint or a talent standpoint, right now, Russell Westbrook at 47 million. You're like, good God, this is a killer of a contract. But that same number, if you put that money on the books in 3 years, is going to look like, boy, that's brutal, but we can negotiate around that. We can navigate those waters and still bring in players, still sign free agents, et cetera. Something that you would be able to do with Kevin Durant's contract going forward.
Yeah, the TV deal is up for the 2025 season. It's going to go up by a ton. Everyone believes that. It could raise the cap 20%, 40%. Like I've seen some big numbers thrown out around this, around about like how much the cap could go up. And where some of these teams have banked on, hey, we'll sign Dame to, like you mentioned before, we'll sign Dame to a huge, or maybe you mentioned this off the air, the Dame to a huge contract. And some of these contracts look completely nuts now
Right.
and just aren't going to look that bad in 4 years, right? Because the money is going to just increase by a massive amount. And so that one should, in theory, make the, Kevin Durant, money more palatable down the line. And he still makes a ton. He's going to make 53 million in 25, 26. You still think he's going to have something left in the tank at that point. And it's not going to be peak, carry an entire team on your shoulders to almost beat the Bucks, Kevin Durant, but it's not going to be sitting in a wheelchair, right? So I think we can agree about that. And you're right, like the money will look more palatable. I think that still needs to be like another year out. We're still too far. We're still too far removed from that happening to have it be to make you feel better. And teams shouldn't be as worried about it. I do think it's funny. I think in terms of like the leverage piece, this is the other example of like where it's just everything goes. This Nets. It's like every timing is wrong on everything with this team. It's like unbelievable. Oh, yeah. We like the worst timing on every single thing over the last 3 years. And I don't want to cry too much over these spilled seasons, but like has like every single, I'm not going to go through the list, the timing and everything, the mandates, the injuries, like the personalities, the guys coming back. It's all been wrong. Right down to when Durant asked for the trade, like the day of free agency. Every other team is just going in a totally different direction, figuring out who they're going to sign and where they're going to go. And he drops his bombshell that maybe some people know about. Like that was the worst timing.
Yeah.
Do that before the draft when you can just start throwing draft picks out or something like that. And maybe
do you think that, by the way, like, so it's a fascinating point because on the one hand, you go, really sticking it to the Nets on the way out the door with your timing of it. But Kevin Durant, maybe regardless of what the motivation was, but the decision of when he chose to request a trade, it's like, buddy, if you wanted to get out of here, you gotta send out the smoke signal now to let teams get involved in this. Instead, because of how he waits, he obviously hurts the Nets' ability to move him, but he hurts his own value. Like it's nuts to think about. You mentioned the timing of everything. It's also like self-inflicted timing. Like the organization, the team, the players, everybody manages to also make a misstep, even if it theoretically is supposed to help everything move forward. You do it at the exact wrong time, and now this is where we find ourselves.
Right, like do a pre-draft. You at least get this year's draft pick thrown into the mix for the compensation package, and like going into that year, right? Nets can draft a guy. It's like all would have been helpful. It's on the eve of free agency that it happens. It's all the worst timing, but it can't happen any other way because nothing around this team ever is timed correctly. It's all bad. It's like every injury was just the wrong time. Hey, by the way, this isn't me just like doing this old fan thing where it's like, oh, everything goes wrong for my team. Make a list of all the stuff that's happened with the Nets over the last couple of years and just figure out how, if it had just been a month sooner or later with some of this stuff, how much different it would have affected all of their stuff. Like that is just true. And that's just, and that's not just your typical fandom, where it's like, oh, this always happens to our team. No, this is just, there's enough here. Like there's enough here that we can go through the entire list of all the different crazy stuff that's happened with this team where if they had just waited a month or done it a month earlier or something like that, everything would have looked different. They just seem to have picked the worst time for everything. And this is just another example.
And I'll just put it into a little bit of context because I know we talk about, well, it's the Orlando Magic aren't trading for Kevin Durant or Kevin Durant doesn't want to go there. But look around teams like at 7 and 8, the Trailblazers, the Pelicans, like those would be two prime examples of teams that made a lot of decisions this offseason or made a decision in the draft like the Pelicans did where you'd go, that's a really attractive asset. Where all of a sudden the Brooklyn Nets, when we talk about making these trades and what is the value of what you're getting back in return, well, that's quantifiable. You can have the 7th overall pick in the draft. You can have the 8th overall pick in the draft. Everything else going forward is depending on how teams finish, depending on where the assets are, right? Instead, the Nets could control what would obviously be one of the most favorable things you could have, a young talent. You could make your pick if you saw someone desirable in the draft. Instead, you missed that window. So there were a couple of teams there. You're not going to say OKC, you're not going to say Houston, but there were real viable potential partners there that you missed the opportunity for that as well, which is incredibly frustrating. I will say, coming up over the course of this week, August is going to be, we're going to move into a little bit. We'll see. We always say maybe we're going to slow down a little bit, and then we never do. We always end up still putting out way too much content, or hopefully just enough for you at home. There are some interesting conversations around teams that should be maybe in these discussions that I want to get to with you in the coming weeks as we assume nothing's going to happen imminently with Kevin Durant and the Nets.
Yeah, look, I mean, everyone kind of understands is August is the time when most of the NBA world just goes on vacation. I mean, that's a pretty real thing. It's like, this is the time where if things do slow down, you see less moves because GMs are taking their vacation for the year and players are taking their vacations or they're getting back to the gym a little bit. But for the most part, front offices and content folks kind of take off. But hey, we're going to be with you all through August, 3-4 times a week at least. So we'll have it. We got plenty to talk about. Nets, thankfully, are a fruitful, target-rich environment, as it were, when it comes to
yeah. By around less, I meant one less day. So even we cannot drag ourselves away. We should be doing. We should be going to Europe and taking a month off, like all the players and the GMs do. Why don't we? We should do more of that, Doug. Is it financial?
I'm taking a vacation in like 6 years. Yeah. And if you don't believe me on that one, I will happily give you what the timeline has looked like. But I have not. I have not. I'm going to take, I think, my first vacation in 6 years off the grid at some point in August here. And again, if you think that's BS, you can just leave a message in the comment, and I will email you why that has not been the case. Anyway. In the meantime, make sure you go over to YouTube and subscribe to YouTube, and you subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Free and available on all platforms. Leave a comment in YouTube. We're pushing toward 3,000 subscribers over there. Really, really appreciate it. The numbers just keep going up, even though the Nets are in season. And so we are so appreciative. Do all that stuff. Like on YouTube, subscribe wherever you listen to the podcasts.
We end on a somber but hopefully optimistic note. To love someone is nothing. To be loved by someone is something. To love someone who loves you is everything. Bill Russell.
Oh, RIP to a legend. We'll talk about that a little bit later. He passed away on Sunday. Did not mention that, but good job, Adam. One of the great American poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.